Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here in person and online. My name is Daniel Horan, and I am professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture, but before introducing our guest, I want to take a moment to say a bit about the center itself. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with the support of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian tradition, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our event, we here at St. Mary's wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land, and we wish to honor the Native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our Indigenous siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. The format for our program this afternoon is twofold. First, Dr. Reimer-Barry will offer her presentation, and then, if there's time, we'll take some questions from our audience. This is also a good time to remind all of us in attendance that academic events and lectures such as this one are not debates, but are educational opportunities at which local and national experts speak on topics related to their research and expertise. As a Catholic university, St. Mary's College is committed to academic freedom, to exploration of a range of scholarly topics, and respectful engagement. For students here at St. Mary's and in the tri-campus community who wish to continue the discussion that will begin tonight, and to process further, you're invited to a weekly ministry pop-up that takes place tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. in the second floor lounge of the Student Center. Please stop by to debrief and to ask questions with the Center for Faith, Action, and Ministry team, as well as your peers in a welcoming environment. Finally, I've also been asked to remind us, and all those gathered here, that anyone who engages in disruptive or disrespectful behavior will be asked to leave the event. It is now my privilege to introduce our guest today. Dr. Emily Reimer-Barry is Associate Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. Dr. Reimer-Barry's research probes the relationship between social justice and sexuality. Her first book, Catholic Theology of Marriage in an Era of HIV and AIDS, was published in 2015. And her second book, titled Reproductive Justice in the Catholic Church, Advancing Pragmatic Solidarity with Pregnant Women, is forthcoming and available for pre-order from the publisher Rowman and Littlefield. Dr. Reimer-Barry co-edited the 2023 special issue of the Journal of Moral Theology, focusing on intersectional methods in moral theology. She is currently co-editing a volume for the Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church book series with contributors from 4 continents. The volume explores global perspectives on reproductive justice. To give an example of just 3 of Dr. Reimer-Barry's widely cited articles, these include titles Amoris Laetitia at 5, Another Pro-Life Movement is Possible, and On Women's Health and Women's Power, A Feminist Appraisal of Humanae Vitae. Dr. Reimer-Barry's public scholarship includes articles that appear in the National Catholic Reporter, the journal Conscience, U.S. Catholic, Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church Forum blog, and Catholic Moral Theology blog. Dr. Reimer-Barry's service commitments and leadership experience are extensive. We wouldn't have time to hear a lecture if I went through the whole list. But by way of an example, she has served a 2-year term as chair of the College of Arts and Sciences Faculty Assembly at University of San Diego, and 5 years as a department chair of her own department. Dr. Reimer-Barry is a past board member of the Society of Christian Ethics and currently serves on the Board of Faith in Public Life. She is a lector and Christian Action Coordinator at St. Rose of Lima Catholic Church in Chula Vista, California. Please join me in extending a very warm St. Mary's College welcome to Dr. Emily Reimer-Barry.
Thank you, everyone. I also want to welcome you here tonight and thank you for being here. And while I get out my script, I want to say hi to my mom who's watching on Zoom. Doesn't always have the chance to see my public lectures. So that was a very generous introduction, and it really is an honor to be here. The Center for the Study of Spirituality is just doing such great work. So I'm very honored. I also want to welcome Students for Life members who are here, and I thank you for drawing attention to the complexity of this issue. My hope is that through dialogue, we will find places of common ground. If I were to situate these reflections within a single gospel narrative, I think I would focus on the importance of removing the planks in our eye. That's Matthew 7:5 from the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm just reminded each time that I reflect on that passage of how easy it is to see the sawdust in our sisters' eyes. But this portion of the Sermon on the Mount is always challenging for me because I see it as a personal invitation to think about the planks in my own eye. So I would invite you to think through that with me tonight as well. So tonight I'm going to be focusing on some of the structural changes needed in U.S. society in order to advance reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is a social movement that advances a human rights agenda, focusing on the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and the right to raise children in safe and healthy conditions. I seek to contribute to this movement as a Catholic feminist theologian. Sandra Schneiders, IHM's sister and expert in New Testament studies, explains that feminism is a comprehensive ideology rooted in women's experience of sexual oppression, which engages in a critique of patriarchy, embraces an alternative vision for humanity and the earth, and actively seeks to bring this vision to realization. So you'll see within her definition that she goes through this movement of critique, constructive vision, and activism. And that movement of the method of feminist theology is really important in my own understanding of that work as well. Women continue to experience the Catholic Church as a patriarchal institution. So the work of Catholic feminists involves activism both within the Church's own structures and in our social world. So for those of you who've seen the Barbie movie, you'll recall that haunting lyric sung by Grammy Award-winning Billie Eilish, "What was I made for?" The existential crisis at the center of Barbie's story reflects well the struggles of feminist movement. A long tradition of women scholars and activists within Catholicism have pushed back against the idea that women were created to serve men's interests. Catholic feminism boldly proclaims every woman has inherent human dignity and should not be reduced to her procreative potential or her use by more powerful others. In the past few years, I've sought to influence Catholic debates about birth control and abortion by creating awareness about the myriad structural forces that undermine women's holistic flourishing. I'm particularly indebted to scholars of reproductive justice in the US who have argued that we must address the social conditions that influence pregnant women as they are making decisions. Loretta Ross on this slide here is a pioneering thinker and activist within the RJ movement. And she's explained that a pregnant woman, and I quote here, may base her decision on available healthcare, housing, violence, age, finances, her partner, education, immigration status, or other considerations. Combinations of social and economic issues matter. Scholars of reproductive justice have also demonstrated that abortion bans disproportionately disadvantage poor women and women of color. When we criminalize abortion, that furthers the carceral state in opposition to church teachings on restorative justice and the problems of mass incarceration. So here's how I describe my work. Oops. Reproductive justice feminism has these goals: eliminate sexual violence, foster sexual relationships of mutual flourishing, expand access to accurate information about sexuality, prevent unwanted and teen pregnancies, reduce the number of abortions, especially through education, violence reduction, contraceptive use, and changing the conditions in which women feel that their only choice is abortion, and fiercely advocate for women's human rights, including the right to make decisions in conscience about their reproductive health, free from coercion. In tonight's lecture, I will be explaining in agonizing detail just a small fraction of the layered injustices that pregnant women face when they are discerning whether to continue a pregnancy. I'll be drawing from the 4th chapter of my book, which, as Dan said, is available for pre-order, although this is probably not going to be the final cover design, so you can give me feedback on that as well. Womanist ethicist Emily M. Towns asks, what kind of social structures do we need to help form people to achieve the society we want? It is this approach to structural change that forms the basis of shared commitments between a Catholic social ethic and the work of reproductive justice advocates. To see abortion, why is it not coming up? There we go. Key claim: to see abortion as a personal choice without giving sustained attention to the structural factors that impact a pregnant woman's decision-making represents a failure of theological and social analysis. Pregnant women today have reasonable concerns about what is expected of them if they continue a pregnancy. Caring for children requires prioritizing the needs of a vulnerable other and can mean struggling to balance many responsibilities. Class, race, and gender complicate the ways that parents experience and navigate these responsibilities. The Catholic moral tradition has rightly emphasized the interdependence of human persons and the importance of fostering the social conditions for families to thrive. Reproductive justice scholarship does the same. As Dr. Deshawn Taylor explains, the method of reproductive justice shifts the conversation from abstract rights to everyday justice. The reproductive justice framework engages people in their everyday lives and centers the people who need help the most. All right, my words are not coming up. There we go. So here I'm going to examine dimensions of everyday life that must be reformed so that pregnant women have the structural supports they need. Such an approach could create the possibilities for more pregnant women to reasonably see a way forward that safeguards both their well-being and the well-being of their dependent children. So let's start with jobs. Good jobs that pay sufficient wages to support a family with benefits and flexible scheduling are hard to come by in today's economy. While employers may tout the benefits of the gig economy, workers suffer when they lack job security and when they have to work multiple jobs just to pay the bills. The federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour has not changed since 2009. When a pregnant woman is considering whether she will have the resources to provide for a child, a commitment lasting decades of her life, one part of her analysis is the income that she and her partner can expect to earn and the standard of living that they can expect as parents. Workers today are understandably anxious about future earnings. Previous generations of U.S. workers saw rises in productivity and corresponding purchasing power within their lifetimes, but today's workers do not see these benefits. Between 1980 and 2018, income growth was stagnant for all non-elite workers and families. Now, in practice, it can be difficult to determine what counts as a just wage, but it is clearly unjust if a company's profits are not shared with the workers whose labors generated the productivity in the first place. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that CEO compensation has grown 1,460% since 1978, while typical compensation for workers has risen just 18%. In 2022, CEOs of the top 350 firms in the U.S. made an average of $27.8 million each, which is an 11% increase from 2020 and represents 399 times more than their workers. The EPI report explains that exorbitant CEO pay is a contributor to rising inequality that we could restrain without doing any damage to the wider economy. Most pregnant women are not, it turns out, CEOs. Racism also has long-term impacts on generational wealth. Thomas Shapiro exposes the disadvantages experienced by communities of color because of the persistence of the racial wealth gap. Focusing on inherited wealth and the advantages that inherited wealth yields, Shapiro shows that when people who are already privileged by race and class have greater access to educational resources and better paying jobs, this perpetuates racial inequality. Racism is also a factor in unemployment and underemployment trends in the U.S. The unemployment rate for Black Americans fell below 5% in the U.S. for the first time ever in April 2023, after peaking at 16% in May of 2020. Still, the Black-white unemployment gap persists. Economist Anthony Annett explains that prolonged unemployment is corrosive to human flourishing. Not only does it lead to a loss of lifetime earnings, but it also worsens health, impedes the educational advancement of children, and depletes trust and social capital. Anti-racist practices and DEI programs in the workplace will continue to be necessary to implement reproductive flourishing, even as politicians like Ron DeSantis of Florida seek to end such programs. Pregnant and nursing workers often have specific bodily needs that require accommodation: restroom breaks, space and time for pumping breast milk, time off for doctor appointments, workspaces that accommodate a growing belly. These too constitute essential aspects of reproductive flourishing for workers, and long supported by the Catholic Church, yet rarely part of the conversation about what it means to advance pro-life policies. Working for the Catholic Church can be a challenge for employees for very practical reasons: low wages, incomplete benefits, overwork, discriminatory hiring and firing practices. These are only part of the story of what it means to work as a diocesan employee today. While this could be an opportunity for bishops to walk the talk about building a culture of life for working families today, it has not been a focus of their assemblies or of any published documents. Catholic universities deserve scrutiny in this regard as well, since the labor of contingent faculty, graduate students, and staff is not always fairly compensated. Let's talk about housing. I don't know why it's not showing. In the US today, affording a place to live in dignity remains elusive for far too many families. The National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty estimates that each year 2.5 to 3.5 million Americans sleep in shelters, transitional housing, and public places not meant for human habitation. The root causes of homelessness include lack of affordable housing, poverty, unemployment, domestic violence, homophobia, and transphobia. Known breakdowns within the social safety net include failures to address the needs of veterans, minors transitioning out of foster care, and previously incarcerated offenders transitioning from confinement. Consider the State of Americans Children Report 2023 excerpt on the slide. To afford fair market rent for a two-bedroom rental nationally, a single person working full-time must make almost $26 an hour, more than 3.5 times the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. And while 30 states and the District of Columbia have now have minimum wages higher than the federal minimum wage, the average minimum wage worker must still work 96 hours per week, nearly 2.5 full-time jobs, to afford a two-bedroom rental. Even in states with the most affordable housing, Arkansas, Missouri, and New Mexico, a family still must have at least 1.5 full-time jobs at minimum wage to afford a two-bedroom rental. In the least affordable states, it takes 3.5 and 4 full-time jobs at minimum wage, respectively, to afford housing. These impossible scenarios are commonplace all over the country. The complexity and interrelated nature of the U.S. housing crisis and of persistent low wages requires us to think about structural responses. Interpersonal aid, local charities, and crisis pregnancy centers can offer some assistance to women and children in need, but they do not solve the underlying root causes. In addition, the high cost of housing is not a problem that is easily isolated from issues of racial discrimination, income inequality, education, or neighborhood segregation. Racial disparities in homeownership persist. The homeownership rate for white Americans is 72%, followed by Asian Americans at 62%, Hispanic Americans at 50%, and Black Americans at 44%. Black homeowners spend more of their income to own their homes than other racial groups, with 30% being cost burdened because they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Beyond affordability, other factors that contribute to racial differences include discriminatory practices within the lending and refinancing process, and realtors steering buyers towards or away from particular neighborhoods. The history of housing discrimination in the U.S. includes redlining policies of the Federal Housing Administration after the New Deal, policies that refuse to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, even as the same program was investing in white-dominant suburban developments. Other factors that demonstrate housing inequalities in the U.S. today include lack of access to parks and over-policing in communities of color. People of color are 3 times more likely to live in nature-deprived neighborhoods where they have diminished access to parks, walking paths, and green spaces in comparison to white families. Just policing remains an important aspect of building a culture of life in the U.S. Policing today is under scrutiny for failing to address discriminatory practices. The right to raise a family in safe and healthy environments is a key focus of reproductive justice activism precisely because these racialized realities exist. Unsafe and unhealthy neighborhoods intersect with the healthcare and family planning decisions that pregnant women make. Let's talk about nutrition. It is a cruel irony that the year following the Dobbs ruling was also a year for high food prices. While food prices generally increase about 2%, they increased 11% in 2022 and 6.7% in 2023. The U.S. Government Accountability Office also explains that there were unique challenges in 2022. These include an outbreak of avian flu, which increased the price of eggs, the war in Ukraine, which disrupted the global supply of agricultural commodities, and drought in some growing regions, which influenced supply and therefore prices. The U.S. is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, yet millions suffer from hunger and malnutrition. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, household food insecurity affected 12.5% of households with children in 2021. Rates of food insecurity were higher than the national average for households with children headed by a single woman, as well as households with incomes below 185% of the poverty line. Food insecurity is related to larger patterns of environmental racism. For example, there are over 6,500 food deserts in the U.S. A food desert is a geographic area where residents have few to no convenient options for securing affordable and healthy foods, especially fresh produce. According to research by Kelly Bauer, food deserts disproportionately impact communities of color, especially Black Americans. Not only do pregnant women need affordable and healthy foods, but so do their children. If a family is already struggling to meet the nutritional needs of members of the household, welcoming another child can seem not only unwise, but unjust for the already born malnourished children for whom one is obliged to care. Let's talk about healthcare. According to research by the Kaiser Family Foundation, health costs associated with pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum care average a total of over $18,000, and the average out-of-pocket payments total $2,854 for women enrolled in large group insurance plans. Many factors influence the cost of maternity care. For example, vaginal delivery is less expensive than delivery by cesarean section. A medicated birth or induction also increase costs. Mothers and infants who require intensive care or prolonged hospitalization will incur larger hospital bills. Insurance plans vary, as do the costs of in-network versus out-of-network costs. Some families will qualify for Medicaid or state-level CHIP programs, that stands for Children's Health Insurance Programs, but 10 states have not expanded Medicaid in the wake of the Affordable Care Act. The problem is not only about affordability, it is also about accessibility. Finding a provider who will accept Medicaid and CHIP can be difficult. Compounding these problems are the closure of hospital maternity wards, especially in rural communities. Hospital administrators say that closures are driven by low Medicaid reimbursement rates, staffing shortages after the COVID pandemic, and declining birth rates. From 2004 to 2014, 9% of rural counties lost their obstetrics services, with an additional 45% of rural counties having no obstetric services. The loss of hospital obstetrics services impacts more than 18 million women of reproductive age who live in rural counties. Nearly 500,000 women give birth each year in rural hospitals. Even though Catholic teachings describe access to health care as a human right, the U.S. bishops lobbied against the Affordable Care Act and seem poised to further restrict health care for patients in Catholic hospitals as they revise the ethical and religious directives. Let's talk about childcare. Parents with minor children at home make up 1/3 of the workforce, and finding affordable childcare is essential both to child welfare and to parental employment. But too often in the U.S. context, such issues are framed as personal dilemmas instead of structural problems. Consider this. The Family and Medical Leave Act enables eligible employees to take up to 12 weeks of job-protected, unpaid leave for certain family and medical reasons. But only 56% of U.S. employees are eligible for the Family Medical Leave Act. Further, taking an unpaid leave is out of reach for many families who depend on the regular salary of working parents. A U.S. Census Bureau survey in 2022 found that more than 365,000 adults reported losing a job because they needed to take time to care for children under the age of 5 in the 4 weeks preceding the survey. One of the structural issues that parents face is that there are not enough childcare centers. A 2020 report found that there were only enough licensed childcare slots to provide care for 23% of U.S. infants and toddlers. The term childcare desert refers to an area in which licensed childcare supply is far short of the population of children and reflected the status of 80% of the counties studied. But even when families find a childcare center, daycare costs an average of $11,000 annually and is more than the price of public college in 33 states. You'll see on the slide here that in Indiana, high-quality infant daycare costs over $25,000 a year. Oh, I didn't advance my slide. Sorry. You'll see on this slide that high-quality daycare in Indiana costs $24,000 a year. Let's move on. For pregnant women who are willing and able to continue a pregnancy and birth, but unwilling or unable to parent, placing a child with adoptive parents can serve the needs of all parties. Many birth parents report high satisfaction with their placement decisions, even as these are accompanied by grief and mixed emotions. But there can also be numerous challenges in this process, and those are complicated by financial cost, legal barriers, and the problematic ways in which the adoption industry fosters a transactional approach to child welfare. In fact, adoption placement is a rare choice for people who become pregnant. Infant adoptions in the U.S. constitute approximately 0.5% of live births. Scholars have concluded that political promotion of adoption as an alternative to abortion is likely not grounded in the reality of women's decision-making, and that's from the Turnaway study. Further, child welfare programs in the U.S. are failing to meet the needs of vulnerable children. In 2019, there were approximately 424,000 children in foster care. In some cases, the neglect that children experience in the home is rooted in poverty, but the foster care system removes children from their home instead of addressing the social supports that would enable caregivers to provide a more stable home life for the child. Youth in foster care experience disruptions and, in some cases, abuse by foster parents. Foster America reports that 70% of youth in the juvenile justice system have been involved with the child welfare system. 50% of foster youth will not graduate from high school on time. 48% of girls in foster care become pregnant by the age of 19. 60% of child trafficking victims have been in foster care. 33% of homeless young adults have been in foster care. And kids in foster care are 4 times more likely than other children to attempt suicide. These patterns of suffering are related to other kinds of systemic social problems, including structural racism and the broken social safety net. Educational inequality in the U.S. begins at the age of 3. In a 2019 study among 3 and 4-year-olds, only 1% of Latino children and 4% of Black children were enrolled in a high-quality preschool program. Racial inequities persist through the high school experience. The National Association of Secondary School Principals reports that in many urban areas, a majority of students of color attend public schools where at least 75% of students are from low-income families. Segregation and redlining in U.S. history have led to lower property values in neighborhoods with concentrated populations of students of color. This results in fewer financial resources for their schools. Districts serving the largest populations of students of color receive, on average, about $1,800 less per student, or $23 billion less in total in federal, state, and local funding than school districts that predominantly serve white students. These disparities lead to what educators call the opportunity gap, whereby students of color have fewer educational opportunities than white students. As a result, average reading and math scores have been lower for students of color than their white peers since 1992. The COVID pandemic exacerbated existing inequalities. 2023 math and reading scores for American 13-year-olds dropped to their lowest level in decades, reflecting losses caused by COVID and school closures, among other things. The digital divide also exacerbated learning behaviors. Compounding these known injustices are parents' and students' reasonable fears about gun violence on school campuses. There were 650 mass shootings in 2022 and 657 mass shootings in 2023. Guns are the leading cause of death among American children and teens, surpassing motor vehicle deaths and those caused by other injuries. 4 in 10 Americans think schools in their communities are not safe from gun violence, according to a 2023 poll. But the outsized influence of the gun lobby means that national conversations about sensible gun legislation are often met by distortions and obstructions. Let's talk about mass incarceration. Another feature of U.S. life that undermines reproductive justice is the carceral state. Mass incarceration refers to a network of policing, prosecution, incarceration, surveillance, debt, and social control that reproduces social inequalities. It is not the case that all incarcerated women have been convicted of violent crimes. The cash bail system in the U.S. criminalizes poverty because people who cannot afford to pay bail face detention while they await trial. 60% of women in local jurisdiction jails are in pretrial detention because they could not afford to pay bail. Research by the Prison Policy Initiative found that the typical bail amounts to a full year's income for women. And many find that even though they are the primary caregivers of children, they are stuck in jail awaiting trial. 58% of all women in U.S. prisons are mothers, as are 80% of women in jails. Most of these women are incarcerated for drug and property offenses and thereby separated from their children. An alarming number of women and girls encounter the criminal justice system for other reasons. In Ohio, 33-year-old Brittany Watts was charged with abuse of a corpse after she miscarried at 21 weeks of pregnancy. In Connecticut, Sana Dilawar, mother of an 11-week-old daughter, was arrested when she reported her husband's domestic abuse. In Missouri, a judge sentenced Tamarae LaRue, a single mother, to jail for 15 days when her kindergartner missed 14 days of school. In what researchers call a perverse twist of justice, many girls who experience sexual abuse are routed into the juvenile justice system because of their victimization, including as victims of sex trafficking when they are arrested for prostitution. Asylum seekers also experience confinement when they are placed in detention centers as they await their hearing date. 67% of detainees held in immigration and customs enforcement detention centers have no criminal record. In jails, detention centers, and prisons, women experience dehumanizing and violent conditions. In 2023, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation logged more than 800 complaints of staff sexual abuse, but most advocates believe this to be a significant undercount. Women report widespread sexual abuse as an ordinary aspect of confinement. Human rights abuses also include family separation policies, coerced sterilization of immigrant women, that's a case in Georgia, the shackling of pregnant and laboring women, and the withholding of sanitary napkins from menstruating women. These violations of maternal rights, consent, bodily integrity, and human dignity persist because of the ways that incarcerated women experience disempowerment as women within the criminal justice system. But incarceration does not just impact the person who is sent to jail or prison. Incarceration reverberates into the lives of their loved ones. Children whose parents are incarcerated experience disruptions in their everyday lives. This might mean that they have to move in with grandparents or friends, or that they're placed in foster care. Sometimes this necessitates transition to a new school environment. Some of these children experience social stigma, elevated levels of anxiety, loneliness, anger, and depression. Some states ban voting rights and/or food assistance for formerly incarcerated individuals. But when mothers are prevented from accessing food assistance programs, it's their children also who suffer. Improved prenatal diagnostic testing procedures have resulted in increased detection rates of fetal anomalies during pregnancy. Approximately 3% of babies are born with some type of birth defect, and they can be very mild or life-threatening. The most common birth defects are heart defects, cleft lip, cleft palate, Down syndrome, and spina bifida. Here I want to address the structural needs that pregnant women facing diagnosis of fetal anomaly experience. For example, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports that over 40% of families of children with Down syndrome had a family member who stopped working because of the child's condition, and 40% reported that the child's condition caused financial problems for the family. Catholic theologian Mary Jo Iozio explains that in medical literature and political discourse, we too often describe a dignified life as a life that is free of dependency. And this quote is on the slide. She says, "When the hegemonic norms of independence are held as sacrosanct, it is no wonder that many would begin to think that any conditions resembling dependence ought to be shunned, or that death or abortion for the fetus diagnosed with genetic anomaly ought to be preferred." Instead, Iozio calls our attention to the data that many persons living with disability report that they are happy, and that except for the stigma associated with disabilities, their lives are satisfying. But it is also the case that the systems in place today, healthcare, education, low wages, and so forth, put many parents in an impossible situation, and in some cases raise doubts for pregnant women about whether and how they can afford to raise a child with special needs. The questions families face will depend on the prenate's diagnosis and on their situational context. Will our insurance plan cover the surgeries our doctors say will be necessary? How will we pay to renovate our home to make it wheelchair accessible? Does our school district offer inclusive education that will meet our child's needs? Will I be able to return to work? I think it's important not to censor such questions or describe them as selfish on the part of the pregnant woman discerning how best to proceed given her finite resources and the many unknowns that she faces. Such reflection instead indicates the social failures of U.S. society and the complex realities in which pregnant women face agonizing discernments. The road ahead is anything but easy. It needs to begin with honesty. Faith communities need to be honest about the very real constraints that pregnant women report. From there, I suggest that we need to summon the willpower to work on collective social change rooted in pragmatic solidarity with pregnant women. Pragmatic here means not just words of support, but actual help. So here are my do's and don'ts. The Catholic feminist vision of reproductive justice includes the following do's and don'ts. Don't criminalize poverty. Don't criminalize pregnancy and pregnancy loss. Don't engage in reproductive coercion. Don't engage in or tolerate sexual violence. And also don't remain apathetic to women's suffering. Do recognize the moral dilemmas that pregnant women face. And dilemma here means that a woman faces conflicting moral requirements. So two principles that are in conflict, and she can't satisfy both of them. And frequently that also leads to what scholars call moral injury, not being able to satisfy all moral requirements. So do recognize the moral dilemmas that pregnant women face. Do address the root causes of poverty, racism, and sexism. Do raise your voice, take action, inform your conscience, and vote. If pregnant women could depend on practical supports, such as good jobs, fair wages, safe housing, opportunities for homeownership, adequate nutrition, affordable health care, affordable childcare, quality public education, an end to gun violence, increased supports for caring for children with special needs, and freedom from sexual and relationship violence. This would radically reshape the discernments that pregnant women face. Women would still face the finitude that comes with being human, but removing the social constraints that are currently barriers to continuing pregnancies would be a huge and important shift. Such structural supports are possible, but they require significant social change and radical solidarity to achieve. So if you care about these issues, I encourage you to join existing movements. Call your elected representatives. Tell them to support the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act, which is going from the House to the Senate now. I also want to raise up the work of Faith in Public Life Action, which is a multi-faith and multiracial coalition advancing the moral imperative for a just, inclusive, and equitable country. I want to raise up especially their work on healthcare access and equity. You can learn more by getting on their mailing list. There are a ton of great organizations that are working in this space to address social injustices. One sign of hope on the horizon in the U.S. today is the bicameral Momnibus Act to End America's Maternal Health Crisis, which is made up of 13 bills, including legislation that would make critical investments to address social determinants of health, food assistance programs, especially eligibility in the postpartum and breastfeeding periods, provide funding for community-based organizations that promote equity, expand access to maternal mental health care, improve programs for mothers who are incarcerated, and more. Such an approach would be an important first step towards a more just future. I've also included on the slide advocating for an expansion of Medicaid in the Post-Affordable Care Act context. To see abortion as a personal choice without giving sustained attention to the structural factors that impact a pregnant woman's decision-making represents a failure of theological and social analysis. But it's also the case that since Dobbs, little progress has been made in achieving structural justice. In some cases, vulnerable populations are in a more precarious situation now. But reproductive flourishing requires social supports. Decisions about fertility and reproduction are made within this fundamentally unjust society in which race, class, and sex determine options and fundamental freedoms are not equal for all. Because of the lack of social supports, many women report that abortion seems like the best option for them. I have identified specific structural supports that would promote reproductive flourishing in the U.S. today, and I believe that these are nonpartisan issues that could promote common ground among activists who seek the full flourishing of women and children in U.S. society. In the Catholic Church in particular, church teachings already provide robust critique of neoliberal capitalism and strong supports for child welfare, fair wages, and an end to violence against women and children. We need to continue in this work. The fact that social change is difficult should not deter us. Let's do better together. Thank you.